Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Last week I published this video where I'd made some time lapses using the photographs from the Artemis II mission, but I left the video on somewhat of a cliffhanger. When scrolling through the various photos, I found a few that I was able to bring to life in a rather different way, and the results of some of those absolutely blew my mind. But those are for the next video. So firstly, apologies to some of my regular viewers who were a bit put out with me ending the video like that. However, I hope it was worth the wait because as the title highlights, I've been able to turn some of the Artemis material into 3D. Now, I wanted to make this video viewable to as many people as possible, and I'm very mindful that typically 3D content requires some form of special eyewear, because we get our 3D depth perception by the fact that we're viewing a scene from two different perspectives simultaneously. Our left eye is seeing a slightly different vantage point than our right, and our brain combines them together, and with that we get that sense of depth. But a photograph is two-dimensional, and to see it in 3D, you need two slightly different photos being fed into each eye independently. So the common ways to do that are with sort of red-blue glasses like these, where you make the left eye image red and the right eye image blue, and then the glasses can filter the images so they only are seen by the respective eyes. Another common way in recent years is with VR headsets, because each eye looks at a different screen, so you just project a different photo into each eyepiece. However, that means you either need glasses like these or an expensive VR headset. However, there is another way that you can do this, which is by going cross-eyed. If you place the right eye image on the left side of the screen and the left eye image on the right side of the screen, and then you stare at the area in the middle of the screen and go cross-eyed, your right eye is looking at the right eye photo, your left eye is looking at the left eye photo, but each eye struggles to see the other photo in their peripheral, and what you get appearing in the middle is a 3D image as your brain merges the views from the two eyes together, with no need for additional hardware. Now, I did a similar video last year where I made 3D versions of a lot of the Apollo photos from the moon. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link to it in the description below. And for that, I showed two versions of each image. One as a cross-eye version, so everybody is potentially able to see them, but I appreciate that going cross-eyed can be difficult or uncomfortable for some people, so just in case I also showed red-blue versions as well for anybody that happens to have 3D glasses. And for anybody that doesn't and they struggle with the cross-eye, these are pretty cheap to get hold of online these days. You may just need to come back to this video at a later date. But for what it's worth, I personally prefer the cross-eyed versions because you get truer colours rather than the slightly distorted colours from viewing through coloured glasses. And if you're struggling with the 3D effect with the cross-eye version, I personally find moving further back from the screen helps because you then don't need to go as cross-eyed to see the respective photos. So let's kick off with what might be a potential first. This is a photo of the Orientale basin, which is located on the far side of the moon, and the Artemis crew were actually the first people to see this basin in its entirety with their own eyes. It's previously been captured by unmanned probes, and some of the Apollo missions even captured parts of it, but Apollo missions were too low of an altitude and not low enough of a latitude to see it in its entirety. So this may well be the first 3D version of a handheld photo of the Orientale basin. Or I could just be talking rubbish. And here is the red-blue version as well, but for this one I turned the photos 90 degrees compared to the cross-eye version so they can be larger on the screen. Now, I did mention in my previous video, Hank Green has put together a website in which people can go and vote for their favourite Artemis photos. And one of the most popular groups of photos by far were the ones taken while the moon was eclipsing the sun. And I did make these into a time-lapse of photos, but since they were taken from the spacecraft as it was moving past the moon, this is actually giving us a shifting perspective of the moon in relation to the stars. Thus, we can turn this into a pretty effective 3D photo in both cross-eyed and in red-blue. And here's the really cool part. If you're looking at a scene, each eye is seeing a slightly different perspective, but if you then move sideways a bit, like if you move left by exactly the amount of distance there is between your eyes, then what your left eye was seeing to begin with will now be being seen by your right. So if you had two cameras side by side taking a stereo pair of photos, and after each shot you move them by the width of the camera, then every stereo pair would basically be the trailing camera seeing exactly what the leading camera has just seen. That might sound a bit complicated, but what it means is I can take the time lapse that I made of the lunar flyby, where the camera is moving from right to left, and I set that as the left eye view. I then duplicate the time lapse, but I delay the whole thing by one frame, and I put it as the right eye view, and we can then view the time lapse as a 3D video. Though unfortunately this didn't seem to work too well with the red-blue version because the layers were jumping around a bit too much. We can even do the same thing with the Hello World shot too. This is the time-lapse that's been sending everybody nuts because you can see satellites orbiting the Earth, but again, because the camera's moving slightly sideways, we can force a 3D effect into it to give it another layer of depth. And the red-blue version works quite well with this one. Next, for some of the photos taken during Earthset, which was when Artemis was passing behind the moon. This was the cross-eye version, and here is a red-blue version of it. Though I have another one of Earthset, but this time from when they used a much longer focal length, so we see less of the moon, but the Earth is much clearer. And here is the red-blue version. And I like this one because it's just as the Earth is starting to kiss the edge of the moon's horizon. Now, when it comes to making 3D effective, generally I find the best ways are when there's a lot of depth in the scene, i.e., objects that are very close to the camera as well as objects that are very far away. Though that can be quite difficult when you just have objects that are in space all very far away. So I thought it would be good if I could find a shot where the window frame was in view. And I managed to find these photos looking at Earth with the edge of the window frame just in view. Now, it does work in 3D, but it's not ideal. I can't quite put my finger on it. I think it's perhaps that the Earth's just too far away from the window frame. So when you're looking at the Earth, you don't really notice the window frame, and if you try focusing on the window frame, you can't because it's out of focus in the photo. So I continued looking through the photos, and I was able to find another sequence of Earthset, but shot with a wide enough view that the edge of the window is visible. Not only that, but the sun is just out of view on the right, which is putting a lot of glare and reflections across the window. This just takes things to another level in terms of 3D depth. That it's not just the Earth and the moon like we saw earlier. This feels more like we're actually looking through a window at it. I had a similar one which I'd made into a time-lapse for the previous video. And because I had it as a sideways moving time-lapse, I was again able to force this into a 3D video. Now, the window frame isn't visible in this one, so it loses a little bit of character, I think. But then there's a lot of reflections on the window that are moving around, which still does add more depth to it. However, unfortunately, whilst the cross-eyed version seems to work quite well, I found the red-blue version didn't look as smooth. There seems to be quite a bit of ghosting on the Earth, which then starts to look odd when it appears as though the Earth is being obstructed before it's actually reached the moon. But we're not done yet, because I then found what I think has turned into my favourite photo in 3D. This one shows the window much clearer and the glass is covered in dust. And because it's shot with a wide-angle lens, there's a very deep depth of field, so the dust specks are more in focus and more noticeable. That really brings this to life for me. When I first saw the initial photo in the Artemis gallery, I almost felt giddy with the idea of how this could look in 3D. And when I saw it in 3D, I had to pick my jaw up off the floor. And it works well in red-blue as well, though again for this one I rotated it 90 degrees in order to fill more of the screen. But this was almost topped on my list of favourites when I landed upon these photos that show the Earth out of the window, but taken from much further away from the window and the interior is brightly lit. This had the potential to be mind-blowing. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it to work quite as well as I was hoping for, which I think is due to the camera moving around a bit too much between the shots, both sideways but also vertically. You'll note on the red-blue version that the Earths are sitting across from each other side to side, as you typically want with such photos. But everything within the cabin is shifting more up and down, which is causing all sorts of ghosting that's quite distracting. And I can't align the interior to be side by side because then the Earth shifts vertically. Now, to round things off, I have a couple from the initial launch of Artemis, but these aren't time lapses, these are straight video. And I am going to save the best till last. There were a lot of cameras recording the launch of the Artemis II mission. NASA had numerous cameras covering it, ones on the launch pad capturing the initial liftoff, tracking cameras further afield that followed it through the ascent. They even had cameras in planes circling above Florida. Then there were the thousands of people who went to watch it in person, many of whom were recording it. Even the likes of Red's Rhetoric and Astronomy Live, both of whom recorded the launch with telescopes following the rocket through the ascent, similar to some of NASA's own cameras. So these give us views from different perspectives, which opens up the potential of making them 3D. Now, Astronomy Live actually has already done a video of some of the Artemis stuff made into 3D, like he did Hello World and one of the Moon. However, he also included a 3D version of his launch footage paired up with one of the NASA cameras. I'll leave a link to his video down below, and I highly recommend following his channel as well, since he's got a lot of other great stuff that he's done. Like he even did a few live streams literally tracking the Artemis crew en route to the moon through his telescope. However, when I was looking through the NASA video archive, I noticed a different camera view of theirs which seemed to be a better pairing for Astronomy Live's footage. So I reached out to him to try and get hold of his original launch footage rather than using the YouTube compressed version that he'd already uploaded, and I explained what I had planned and what footage I was planning on pairing it with, and he very kindly not only sent me his file, but he'd gone through the trouble of stabilizing his footage to try and make it match the NASA video I'd found as well. That saved me having to do it myself, so a big thank you to him for that. So I put them together in a cross-eyed version, and immediately you can see a strong 3D effect with the rocket versus the tower, and the initial liftoff looks incredible. However, during the ascent we hit a few problems. The footage from Astronomy Live was a little bit bouncy. Now, that is in no way a criticism of him. I certainly don't envy the task of trying to track a rocket launch with a motorized telescope from several miles away. He certainly did a much better job than I could do. But for the best 3D effect, the two sides need to remain aligned with each other, in the sense that if you're following an object with your eyes, both eyes move together to keep watching the one object. You don't have one eye perfectly follow something whilst the other one keeps looking all over the place. Or if you do, I suggest you go see a doctor immediately. So what this meant was the stabilized footage cuts off various parts of the frame. Some parts we see lots of the rocket, other parts cut into only seeing a little bit of it. Plus there's then the problem of vantage point locations. NASA's camera footage was from about 3.5 miles south-southeast of the pad, and Astronomy Live was about a further 4 miles south and slightly more east, so about 8 miles from the pad. But that meant as the rocket launched and pitched over to the east, their perspectives to the rocket shifted significantly, so the 3D effect was rather lost until the rocket gets much further away. So I've split the footage into two bits. This is the initial launch, and I've added some audio from one of the close-up cameras just to make it a bit more immersive. Then I've done a second clip from later on when it was much further away. Now, I only did the red-blue for the initial launch because after that, once it starts to pitch and roll over, it really starts to go out of a line and I was struggling to get it to work. However, Astronomy Live has actually redone his video to now use this same NASA camera that I'm using because he felt it was better suited. So if you want to see the full launch in red-blue or using a VR headset, then I suggest head over to his video, which I'll link down below. But now we come to the final video. When I was looking through NASA's video archives, I spotted they had tracking cameras with very high zoomed views that were watching the engines very closely throughout launch. Now, all of their cameras are given codes. This particular one is UCS-15D1. UCS-15 is the location of the camera. And I noticed they had another UCS-15 camera, but this one is UCS-15 NIR, or near infrared. And so it seems they had two cameras at the same location, both recording close-up views of the engines during ascent. One of the cameras was in full colour, and one looks almost black and white because it's recording near infrared light, not visible spectrum. But the cameras are giving slightly different perspectives of the launch, and so are perfect for making into 3D. Just a note, the cameras aren't properly focused at first, so they do look a little bit blurry until a few seconds after launch. So here is the launch with some added audio in cross-eye. Now, the full launch footage of these cameras is about 10 minutes long. So I'm just going to show you some highlights, like this bit a bit later on, the rocket's pitched over and you can now see a bit more of it. Though at this point, the 3D effect is less noticeable because the cameras are quite close to each other, viewing one single thing that's very far away. However, we then later see the solid rocket boosters jettison. I cut the video shortly after this at around 5 minutes because the rest of the footage was just seeing the core stage engines as they get further and further away. But I will put the entire 5-minute 3D video that I've made up as a separate unlisted video, and I'll link it below for anybody who wants to watch it. Had both cameras been full color, this would have been perfect, but ultimately it would have been pointless for NASA since they'd just be recording the same thing twice. Obviously, the infrared camera is seeing what the visible spectrum camera can't, but for 3D, it doesn't cause too much of a problem. All it does is it basically desaturates the colours a little bit. As with some of the others, the red-blue isn't quite as effective because despite NASA stabilising both videos already, they aren't perfectly stabilised, and when the cameras do bounce, they don't bounce at the same time. Usually, one's bouncing whilst the other remains still. And here are the same highlights that I've just showed with the cross-eye version. Again, I will upload the entire thing as a separate unlisted video linked down below. So there we are. I love seeing these things in 3D. It really just brings this stuff even more to life, like you're actually there seeing it in person. And if you've enjoyed this, as I mentioned earlier, I've done a similar video in the past with photos from the Apollo missions on the moon, which you should go and check out. For now, though, that's it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.